And as Trump revives nuclear talks with Iran, tensions deepen over uranium enrichment and Israeli threats. Tehran proposes a counter-proposal, while Trump insists on zero enrichment and says Iran became more aggressive in the talks. Meanwhile, Israel threatens to strike Iranian nuclear sites as Iran accuses the West of double standards and says it has secret Israeli nuclear documents. Will Trump's approach break the deadlock? To what extent is Iran ready to compromise? And will Israel's threats sabotage the negotiations? And I'm Salma Al-Fi'i, and welcome to In Depth. And as reported by Newsweek, Iran has warned it will target Israel's nuclear facilities if attacked, citing intelligence gathered on these sites. The threat coincides with a 40-minute phone call between the U.S. President Donald Trump and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, during which Trump insisted that a military strike on Iran must be taken off the table for now. Netanyahu disagreed, urging a stronger stance. Newsweek highlights growing rifts between Washington and Tel Aviv as Trump pursues diplomacy despite acknowledging Iran's increasingly aggressive posture. Iran's Supreme National Security Council claims it has completed an operational cycle that would enable a retaliatory strike if provoked. Meanwhile, the U.S. maintains that nuclear talks with Iran are making progress, with a sixth round of negotiations expected soon. However, core disputes, especially over uranium enrichment, remain unresolved, increasing the risk of regional escalation.
Talks between the United States and Iran are set to resume, with Tehran finalizing a counter-proposal to Washington's latest nuclear offer. U.S. President Donald Trump insists that Iran must halt uranium enrichment on its soil, calling Iran's current position unacceptable. Trump says the two sides remain far apart, and that Iran has become much more aggressive in nuclear talks. Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesman Ismail Baghai confirmed that a new offer is being prepared, which Iran says it will be logical and balanced. Iranian media report the proposal will be submitted through Oman. Iran argues its program is peaceful and accuses the West of ignoring Israel's undeclared nuclear arsenal. At the same time, Israeli officials continue to threaten military strikes on Iran. Iran, in turn, warns of a proportionate response to any escalation by the Israel or Western powers. In Vienna, the IAEA Board of Governors are holding a 5-day meeting with Iran's nuclear program in the spotlight as Tehran is accused of non-compliance with nuclear non-proliferation obligations. Back in Washington, Trump appears keen to avoid war, but he also wants a deal. Whether this balancing act can survive regional dynamics and Israeli pressures remains uncertain.
And for more analysis, we are joined from Cairo by Dr. Mohammed Osman, the International Relations Specialist, and Mr. Hani Soleiman, the Iranian Affairs Expert. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining me today at In Depth. Let me start off with Dr. Osman. Trump's recent comments revealed growing frustration over Iran's insistence on uranium enrichment. How do you see this being a dispute reflecting the deeper mistrust between Washington and Tehran? And how would it affect the upcoming sixth round of talks, do you think?
Thank you for having me, Salma. Greetings to you, your guest, and the honorable audience.
Thank you.
It seems that the problem of enrichment, or the issue of uranium enrichment, is the biggest outstanding issue in the Iran-USA negotiations over the past few weeks. It seems that even though the two counterparts have went through six sessions of or 6 rounds of negotiations, it doesn't seem that either side is willing to give the necessary compromises on the subject of enrichment. the United States, in its latest proposal presented to Tehran, has insisted that zero enrichment should be the baseline of any future agreement with regards to Iran's nuclear program. Iran, of course, very vocally and publicly rejected the U.S. Proposal, and the Iranian Foreign Ministry even used very harsh language to describe it, calling it delusional before flatly rejecting it. And now the Iranians are preparing their own proposal to present to the Americans. And even the timing of the next round of negotiations is up in the air. We know that there is a next round of negotiation. However, President Trump said it will be on Thursday, meaning tomorrow. The U.S. State Department said maybe it will be on Sunday. So it doesn't seem that even both parties have agreed on the time and place of the next negotiating round, which indicates mistrust and
Yes.
deep disagreements still remain.
Well, Mr. Sulaiman, Dr. Osman just mentioned Iran is preparing a proposal, and it says it's going to be a reasonable and balanced counter proposal accordingly, while warning that if the nuclear negotiations fail and the conflict arises with the U.S., Iran will strike American bases in the region. How likely is Iran to take such an action, and how much room does it really have to compromise, do you think, sir?
Greetings to you and your viewers. I think that we are before the clashes of statements, and each side has tools to try to serve it to gain more gains. And the American side is using the sanction tools to pressure in Iran. And also the upcoming pressures by the IAEA and the quarter yearly of the agency governor, in addition to of the third part by Israel through different threats, but Iran dealt with all threats by different means. From one hand, that employed the diplomatic tools through the statements of the foreign minister, affirming that Iran's readiness to provide transparency and facilitate the outreach in the IAEA and the relevant body. On the other hand, directly used a threat of rhetoric by the IAEA, talking that the three countries, such as Germany, France, and Britain, by issuing resolutions by the Governor Council, described as a strategic mistake. In addition, that Iran dealt with Israel's side through the determined balance by talking to intel documents that they gained related to the Israeli activities and some of vital targets. And therefore, I think that we are about to, before threaten deterrent statements by all, affirm that there are tensions and a great gap between two sides. Each side is trying to pressure the other. As Dr. Osman said, that the contradictions regarding the timing of the upcoming round is affirm the nature of the great gap. But ultimately, up till this moment, vision of a peaceful solution did not crystallized, and we are before one or two negotiations. There is a space of diplomacy, as Rafael Grossi spoke, the general director of the agency, and I think Iran's statement is trying to make some sort of a balance and keep the negotiations in the corner available.
Dr. Osman, the IAEA is reportedly preparing to censure Iran in the Board of Governors, which could trigger a snapback, which is the reimposition of all the UN sanctions that were originally lifted into 2015, the nuclear deal. Do you see this as a move of a step towards multilateral pressure, or an escalation that could collapse the talks?
Of course, this could have some sort, it's a double sword. to be honest. On the one hand, it is being utilized by the United States in order to apply more pressure on Iran to force it to be more flexible in the negotiating process. However, if the sanctions are snapped back on Iran by the entirety of the international community or by the West, at least, namely Britain, France, and Germany, and other EU states. Of course, this will push Iran to be even more stringent and uncooperative and more prone to actually develop its nuclear program to the extent of developing nuclear weapons, even. And this is something that Rafael Grossi himself, the director of the IAEA, said that if Iran is attacked or subjected to immense pressure, he was told by the Iranians that they might actually pursue nuclear weapons.
So Dr. Osman, you actually think it's going to make Iran more uptight rather than actually easing things?
Might, if it's overdone. If it's overdone, as I said, it will be it's a double-edged sword. If it's used wisely, threaten Iran without actually snapping those sanctions back on in full force, maybe then Iran might be prone to be more flexible in the negotiations. However, if they apply those sanctions in order to strangle Iran and corner it, of course, Iran will be more stringent and will be way more aggressive. And President Trump himself described the Iranians that as of late they have become
as being more aggressive in their talks recently.
Exactly. So I think this is, yes, go ahead, please.
No, it's okay. I'll go back to Mr. Soleiman. Iran's deputy nuclear chief, sir, warned that the IAEA of being a proportionate response as the agency is preparing for censuring Iran over its non-compliance with the inspectors. What might that look like, do you think? And how close is Iran to scaling back cooperation with the agency?
Let's say that the report issued by the IAEA really a set of breaches, which is the enrichment percentage that is around 60%, and talk about that the activities in unannounced freeze posts, and talking to that it's related to untransparent with dealing with the IAEA. I think it is neutral regarding its report. Therefore, and I think that reaction incited by the foreign minister of Iraqi and politicizing its work and the council of its governor is an affirmation of Iranians' concern of that report. In addition to that, Balondi's statement, the spokesperson of the Iranian Agency of the Nuclear Energy, is talking about the size of dealing with the agency if they are heading to sanctions based on the council. In light of this statement, in a bit of pressuring the IAEA and keeping the matter in the processing until the October meeting that would lead us to 10 years following the agreement in 2015. And that's a new phase of avoiding sanctions in order to manage negotiation, a kind of buying time, in a bit of entry into other alternatives that might achieve the Iranian goals. At the Iranian response in Witkoff's response, that was likely a rejection. But talking about another Iranian proposal that might include the main red lines, the affirmation of the enrichment right, as well as not to allow the industrial enrichment complex in a third party and keep it within Iran, and talking about lifting the sanctions at the The Speaker of the Shura Council affirmed that Iran wouldn't deal with any alternative proposal,
Okay.
not to include the lifting of the sanctions.
Let me move to Dr. Osman. Um, some analysts agree and argue that Israeli threats of the military strikes might help Trump pressure Iran. How do you read this, and what are your thoughts about that, Doctor?
Unfortunately, these analyses do have some grounds to them. The United
Okay.
States is using the idea of or the threat of a lingering Iranian Israeli attack in the background that is lingering and hovering over those negotiations. It is used by the United States as a form of pressure, and Iran is very concerned about the possibility of an Israeli strike on its nuclear capabilities, especially that such a strike will never happen, in my view, without the consent and the support, basically a green light from the United States. So the United States is.
So, Dr. Osman, in your opinion, you're feeling this is not going to happen?
I don't think it's going to happen unless the negotiations fail. If the negotiations fail, probably we will see an attack, an
Okay,
Israeli.
because
Yeah,
that
an
was my
Israeli.
next question to Mr. Sulaiman. I was going to ask you, Mr. Sulaiman, would you think the Israeli has threatened to strike Iran's nuclear facilities? Do you think Israeli threats will actually strike, and Iran might help and allow Trump to pressure Tehran and secure a better deal? Do you think? What's your opinion, Mr. Sulaiman?
I do not think that there is an American consent of Israeli strike of the nuclear facilities. There is an American attempt to postpone such a proposal. Israel exerted much through the meeting of the chief of Mossad with the U.S. envoy Witkoff to all these attempts rejected by the United States, and I think Donald Trump has some reservation and they give a greater space of diplomacy at larger scale recently. And I think up till this moment, there are several reflections and the impact of any potential strike. In addition to, furthermore, there is some logistic and technical matters related to the distance of the Israeli strike, as Israel bought some of the F-15 aircraft jet to overcome such a matter. But there are other matters, but that the nuclear facilities are far away, so the Israeli attacks might have not a strategic feasibility as well as its repercussions that would reflect the region despite the weakness of the Iranian influence. So the escalation isn't in favor of each part. Furthermore, the Gulf Road, despite its agreement with Iran, but they never wish of the region, or rather the region, to go into a state of instability.
Dr. Osman, Iran has threatened to reveal evidence about Israeli nuclear weapons, and Israel, in turn, has threatened to respond militarily. How do you think these threats are developing, and are you expecting an escalation?
Iran is upping the ante with Israel because it takes the Israeli threats very serious. I have mentioned before. Okay. They have announced that they have carried out a covert intelligence operation that has allowed them to reveal the locations and the positions of several nuclear Israeli assets, meaning places where Israel stores its nuclear weapons and its nuclear infrastructure. Yeah. So you can imagine that what the Iranians are hinting is that if you hit us, we will hit you back, and we will hit your nuclear facilities with our missiles. So that's the very unsubtle and uncovered Israeli warning, excuse me, Iranian warning. And just in reference to statements made by Dr. Suleiman, I never said that an attack is imminent, that an attack will only happen with a U.S. green light. And where I disagree with him is if these negotiations fail, Israel will attack Iran because they have a very vested interest in undertaking such an endeavor. And that's why the Iranians are giving them very stern warnings, telling them that if you attack us, it will not be like our previous missile strikes on Israel that were calculated not to be very damaging. That this time we will target your nuclear infrastructure, and Iran does have the capabilities to retaliate very strongly against Israel, by the way. So this shows that there is a real prospect here of a potential escalation. However, on the other hand, I remain cautiously optimistic about the negotiations. I believe that the current impasse is bridgeable. Both sides, if they are serious about it, they can find a reasonable compromise that will give the United States the guarantees it demands and will also allow Iran to pursue its peaceful nuclear program.
Okay, Mr. Suleiman, Iran hinted at exposing documents on Israel's nuclear program. Do you think, in your opinion, is this purely a negotiating tactic, or does Tehran actually intend to shift international attention towards Israel?
Let's see that the Iranian media around such a document or that did not include any confirmation could have some sort of gain sometimes in order to or emphasize the Iranian allegations, and Iran might have gained such a documentation that would give some sort of deter balance and a sort of competition, and let's say Israel to think about the matter financially and militarily. And I think that the timing of such announcement that Iran will use it very good at the negotiations and to let the international community to have a concern about the nature of the Israeli facilities. But I think this wouldn't be doing any good in light of that the international community is concerned regarding other crises and the continued support or the American support for Israel. So what's happening in Gaza of violations and crimes, I think they are fully enough to play this role. But I think the international community has their own calculations in the other hand. But let's say that it would put more pressure upon Israel, and I think that would change the calculations. But I think also that the Israelis' statement that they're not going to take any military choice against Iran unless that negotiation failed officially. Iran only announced such a documentations in order to gain some time and export the pressures, but to use it practically are subject to other multi-calculated matters.
And Dr. Osman, Trump says he wants to avoid forever wars, according to him, and favors negotiation, while he said he's as confident that the upcoming talks would yield results because Iran's position has become more aggressive, as he describes it. Do you think Trump is more likely at this stage to compromise on the issue of enrichment in that case?
I think the United States will be ready at some point to present some compromises in this regard, because what I am sure of is that the United States is not remotely interested in getting entangled in another conflict in the Middle East, let alone what could be the biggest conflict in the history of the Middle East if they actually try to attack Iran and get dragged into a war with it. So I think that the United States might present more reasonable compromises and arrangements in the future that might allow Iran to enrich uranium at very low levels under very, very rigorous oversight or monitoring and scrutiny, even beyond the International Atomic Energy Agency. And I think Iran, at the end of the day, might play game and also reciprocate with the United States.
Well, unfortunately, we're running out of time, and that was Dr. Mohammad Osman, the International Relations Specialist, and Mr. Hani Soleiman, the Iranian Affairs Expert. Thank you, gentlemen, for being with us today at In Depth. And that concludes today's episode of In Depth. Thank you so much for joining us. Stay tuned for more updates on Q News.